Chapter 28 of The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elaine Tweddle. The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 28. The Samurai's Sword. The muffled drumming of sleepless London seemed very remote from us, as side by side we crept up the narrow path to the studio. This was a starry but moonless night, and the little dingy white building with a solitary tree peeping in silhouette above the glazed roof bore an odd resemblance to one of those tombs which form a city of the dead so near to the city of feverish life on the slopes of the Mokattam Hills. This line of reflection proved unpleasant, and I dismissed it sternly from my mind. A shriek of a train whistle reached me, a sound which breaks the stillness of the most silent London night, telling of the ceaseless, febrile life of the great world capital, whose activity ceases not with the coming of darkness. Around and about us a very great stillness reigned, however, and the velvet dusk, which, with the star-jeweled sky, was strongly suggestive of an Eastern night, gave up no sign to show that it masked the presence of more than 20 men. Some distance away to our right was the Gables, that sinister and deserted mansion which we assumed, and with good reason, to be nothing less than the gateway to the subterranean abode of Dr. Fu-Manchu. Before us was the studio, which, if Nayland Smith's deductions were accurate, concealed a second entrance to the same mysterious dwelling. As my friend, glancing cautiously all about him, inserted the key in the lock, an owl hooted dismally almost immediately above our heads. I caught my breath sharply, for it might be a signal, but looking upward, I saw a great black shape float slantingly from the tree beyond the studio into the coppice on the right which hemmed in the Gables. Silently the owl winged its uncanny flight into the greater darkness of the trees, and was gone. Smith opened the door, and we stepped into the studio. Our plans had been well considered, and, in accordance with these, I now moved up beside my friend, who was dimly perceptible to me in the starlight which found access through the glass roof, and pressed the catch of my electric pocket lamp. I suppose that by virtue of my self-imposed duty as chronicler of the deeds of Dr. Fu-Manchu, the greatest and most evil genius whom the later centuries have produced, the man who dreamt of a universal yellow empire, I should have acquired a certain facility in describing bizarre happenings, but I confess that it fails me now as I attempt in cold English to portray my emotions when the white beam from the little lamp cut through the darkness of the studio and shone fully on the beautiful face of Karamaneh. Less than 6 feet away from me she stood, arrayed in a gauzy dress of the harem, her fingers and slim white arms laden with barbaric jewelry. The light wavered in my suddenly nerveless hand, gleaming momentarily upon bare ankles and golden anklets, upon little red leather shoes. I spoke no word, and Smith was as silent as I. Both of us, I think, were speechless rather from amazement than in obedience to the evident wishes of Fu-Manchu's slave girl. Yet I have only to close my eyes at this moment to see her as she stood, one finger raised to her lips, enjoining us to silence. She looked ghastly pale in the light of the lamp, but so lovely that my rebellious heart threatened already to make a fool of me. So we stood in that untidy studio, with canvases and easels heaped against the wall, and with all sorts of litter about us, a trio strangely met, and one to have amused the high gods watching through the windows of the stars. "Go back," came in a whisper from Karamaneh. I saw the red lips moving, and read a dreadful horror in the widely opened eyes, in those eyes like pools of mystery to taunt the thirsty soul. The world of realities was slipping past me. I seemed to be losing my hold on things actual. I had built up an Eastern palace about myself and Karamaneh wherein, the world shut out, I might pass the hours in reading the mystery of those dark eyes. Nayland Smith brought me sharply to my senses. "Steady with the light, Petrie," he hissed in my ear. "My skepticism has been shaken to-night, but I am taking no chances." He moved from my side and forward toward that lovely, unreal figure which stood immediately before the model's throne and its background of plush curtains. Karamaneh started forward to meet him, suppressing a little cry, whose real anguish could not have been simulated. "Go back! Go back!" she whispered urgently, and thrust out her hands against Smith's breast. "For God's sake, go back! I have risked my life to come here tonight. He knows, and is ready." The words were spoken with passionate intensity, and Nayland Smith hesitated. To my nostrils was wafted that faint, delightful perfume which, since one night 2 years ago it had come to disturb my senses, had taunted me many times as the mirage taunts the parched Sahara traveler. I took a step forward. "Don't move!" snapped Smith. Karamaneh clutched frenziedly at the lapels of his coat. "Listen to me," she said, beseechingly, and stamped one little foot upon the floor. "Listen to me. You are a clever man, but you know nothing of a woman's heart. Nothing, nothing. If seeing me, hearing me, knowing as you do know, I risk, you can doubt that I speak the truth. And I tell you that it is death to go behind those curtains, that he..." "That's what I want to know," snapped Smith. His voice quivered with excitement. Suddenly grasping Karamaneh by the waist, he lifted her and set her aside. Then in 3 bounds he was on to the model's throne and had torn the plush curtains bodily from their fastenings. How it occurred I cannot hope to make clear, for here my recollections merge into chaos. I know that Smith seemed to topple forward amid the purple billows of velvet, and his muffled cry came to me: "Petrie! My God, Petrie!" The pale face of Karamaneh looked up into mine, and her hands were clutching me, but the glamour of her personality had lost its hold, for I knew, heavens, how poignantly it struck home to me, that Nayland Smith was gone to his death. What I hoped to achieve I know not, but hurling the trembling girl aside, I snatched the Browning pistol from my coat pocket, and with the ray of the lamp directed upon the purple mound of velvet, I leaped forward. I think I realized that the curtains had masked a collapsible trap, a sheer pit of blackness, an instant before I was precipitated into it, but certainly the knowledge came too late. With the sound of a soft shuddering cry in my ears, I fell, dropping lamp and pistol, and clutching at the fallen hangings, but they offered me no support. My head seemed to be bursting. I could utter only a hoarse groan as I fell. When my mind began to work again, in returning consciousness, I found it to be laden with reproach. How often in the past had we blindly hurled ourselves into just such a trap as this? Should we never learn that where Fu-Manchu was, impetuosity must prove fatal? On 2 distinct occasions in the past we had been made the victims of this device, yet even although we had had practically conclusive evidence that this studio was used by Dr. Fu-Manchu, we had relied upon its floor being as secure as that of any other studio. We had failed to sound every foot of it ere trusting our weight to its support. "There is such a divine simplicity in the English mind that one may lay one's plans with mathematical precision, and rely upon the Nayland Smiths and Dr. Petries to play their allotted parts. Excepting 2 faithful followers, my friends are long since departed. But here, in these vaults, which time has overlooked, and which are as secret and as serviceable today as they were 200 years ago, I wait patiently, with my trap set, like the spider for the fly." To the sound of that taunting voice I opened my eyes. As I did so I strove to spring upright, only to realize that I was tied fast to a heavy ebony chair inlaid with ivory, and attached by means of 2 iron brackets to the floor. "Even children learn from experience," continued the unforgettable voice, alternately guttural and sibilant, but always as deliberate as though the speaker were choosing with care words which should perfectly clothe his thoughts. "For a burnt child fears the fire, says your English adage. But Mr. Commissioner Nayland Smith, who enjoys the confidence of the India Office, who is empowered to control the movements of the Criminal Investigation Department, learns nothing from experience. He is less than a child, since he has twice rashly precipitated himself into a chamber charged with an anesthetic prepared, by a process of my own, from the lycoperdon, or common puffball." I became fully master of my senses, and I became fully alive to a stupendous fact. At last it was ended. We were utterly in the power of Dr. Fu-Manchu. Our race was run. I sat in a low vaulted room. The roof was of ancient brickwork, but the walls were draped with exquisite Chinese fabric, having a green ground whereupon was a design representing a grotesque procession of white peacocks. A green carpet covered the floor, and the whole of the furniture was of the same material as the chair to which I was strapped, viz., ebony inlaid with ivory. This furniture was scanty. There was a heavy table in one corner of the dungeonesque place, on which were a number of books and papers. Before this table was a high-backed, heavily carven chair. A smaller table stood upon the right of the only visible opening, a low door partially draped with beadwork curtains, above which hung a silver lamp. On this smaller table a stick of incense, in a silver holder, sent up a pencil of vapor into the air, and the chamber was loaded with the sickly sweet fumes. A faint haze from the incense stick hovered up under the roof. In the high-backed chair sat Dr. Fu-Manchu, wearing a green robe upon which was embroidered a design, the subject of which at first glance was not perceptible, but which presently I made out to be a huge white peacock. He wore a little cap perched upon the dome of his amazing skull, and with one clawish hand resting upon the ebony of the table, he sat slightly turned toward me, his emotionless face a mask of incredible evil. In spite of, or because of, the high intellect written upon it, the face of Dr. Fu-Manchu was more utterly repellent than any I have ever known, and the green eyes green as those of a cat in the darkness, which sometimes burned like witch lamps, and sometimes were horribly filmed like nothing human or imaginable, might have mirrored not a soul, but an emanation of hell, incarnate in this gaunt, high-shouldered body. Stretched flat upon the floor lay Nayland Smith, partially stripped, his arms thrown back over his head, and his wrists chained to a stout iron staple attached to the wall. He was fully conscious, and staring intently at the Chinese doctor. His bare ankles also were manacled, and fixed to a second chain, which quivered tautly across the green carpet, and passed out through the doorway, being attached to something beyond the curtain, and invisible to me from where I sat. Fu-Manchu was now silent. I could hear Smith's heavy breathing, and hear my watch ticking in my pocket. I suddenly realized that although my body was lashed to the ebony chair, my hands and arms were free. Next, looking dazedly about me, my attention was drawn to a heavy sword, which stood hilt upward against the wall, within reach of my hand. It was a magnificent piece of Japanese workmanship, a long, curved, damascened blade having a double-handed hilt of steel, inlaid with gold, and resembling fine cuff work. A host of possibilities swept through my mind. Then I perceived that the sword was attached to the wall by a thin steel chain some 5 feet in length. "If you had the dexterity of a Mexican knife-thrower," came the guttural voice of Fu Manchu, "you would be unable to witch me, dear Dr. Petrie." The Chinaman had read my thoughts. Smith turned his eyes upon me momentarily, only to look away again in the same direction of Fu Manchu. My friend's face was slightly pale beneath the tan, and his jaw muscles stood out with unusual prominence. By this fact alone did he reveal his knowledge that he lay at the mercy of this enemy of the white race, of this inhuman being who himself knew no mercy, of this man whose very genius was inspired by the cool, calculated cruelty of his race, of that race which to this day disposes of hundreds, nay, thousands of its unwanted girl children by the simple measure of throwing them down a well specially dedicated to the purpose. "The weapon near your hand," continued the Chinaman imperturbably, "is a product of the civilization of our near neighbors, the Japanese, a race to whose courage I prostrate myself in meekness. It is the sword of a samurai, Dr. Petrie. It is of very great age, and was, until an unfortunate misunderstanding with myself led to the extinction of the family, a treasured possession of a noble Japanese house." The soft voice, into which an occasional sibilance crept, but which never rose above a cool monotone, gradually was lashing me into fury, and I could see the muscles moving in Smith's jaws as he convulsively clenched his teeth, whereby I knew that, impotent, he burned with a rage at least as great as mine. But I did not speak, and did not move. "The ancient tradition of seppuku," continued the Chinaman, "or hara-kiri, still rules, you know, in the great families of Japan. There is a sacred ritual that the samurai who dedicates himself to this honorable end must follow strictly the ritual. As a physician, the exact nature of the ceremony might possibly interest you, Dr. Petrie, but a technical account of the 2 incisions which the sacrificant employs in his self-dismissal might, on the other hand, bore Mr. Nayland Smith. Therefore, I will merely enlighten you upon one little point, a minor one, but interesting to the student of human nature. In short, even a samurai, and no braver race has ever honored the world, sometimes hesitates to complete the operation. The weapon near to your hand, my dear Dr. Petrie, is known as the friend's sword. On such occasions as we are discussing, a trusty friend is given the post, an honored one of standing behind the brave man who offers himself to his gods, and should the ratter's courage momentarily fail him, the friend with the trusty blade, to which I now especially direct your attention, diverts the hierophant's mind from his digression, and rectifies his temporary breach of etiquette by severing the cervical vertebra of the spinal column with the friendly blade, which you can reach quite easily, Dr. Petrie, if you care to extend your hand." Some dim perceptions of the truth was beginning to creep into my mind. When I say a perception of the truth, I mean rather of some part of the purpose of Dr. Fu-Manchu, of the whole horrible truth of the scheme which had been conceived by that mighty evil man I had no glimmering, but I foresaw that a frightful ordeal was before us both. "That I hold you in high esteem," continued Fu-Manchu, "is a fact which must be apparent to you by this time, but in regard to your companion, I entertain very different sentiments." Always underlying the deliberate calm of the speaker, sometimes showing itself in an unusually deep guttural and sometimes in an unusually serpentine sibilance, lurked the frenzy of hatred which in the past had revealed itself occasionally in wild outbursts. Momentarily I expected such an outburst now, but it did not come. "One quality possessed by Mr. Nayland Smith," continued the Chinaman, "I admire. I refer to his courage. I would wish that so courageous a man should seek his own end, should voluntarily efface himself from the path of that world movement which he is powerless to check. In short, I would have him show himself a samurai. Always his friend, you shall remain so to the end, Dr. Petrie. I have arranged for this." He struck lightly a little silver gong dependent from the corner of the table, whereupon from the curtained doorway there entered a short, thickly built Burman, whom I recognized for a dacoit. He wore a shoddy blue suit which had been made for a much larger man, but these things claimed little of my attention, which automatically was directed to the load beneath which the Burman labored. Upon his back he carried a sort of wire box rather less than 6 feet long, some 2 feet high and about 2 feet wide. In short, it was a stout framework covered with fine wire netting on the top, sides and ends, but being open at the bottom. It seemed to be made in 5 sections, or to contain 4 sliding partitions which could be raised or lowered at will. These were of wood, and in the bottom of each was cut a little arch. The arches of the 4 partitions varied in size, so that whereas the first was not more than 5 inches high, the fourth opened almost to the wire roof of the box or cage, and a fifth, which was but little higher than the first, was cut in the actual end of the contrivance. So intent was I upon this device, the purpose of which I was wholly unable to divine, that I directed the whole of my attention upon it. Then, as the Burman paused in the doorway, resting a corner of the cage upon the brilliant carpet, I glanced towards Fu-Manchu. He was watching Nayland Smith, and revealing his irregular yellow teeth, the teeth of an opium smoker, in the awful, mirthless smile which I knew. "God!" whispered Smith. "The 6 gates!" "The knowledge of my beautiful country serves you well," replied Fu Manchu gently. Instantly I looked to my friend, and every drop of blood seemed to recede from my heart, leaving it cold in my breast. If I did not know the purpose of the cage, obviously Smith knew it all too well. His pallor had grown more marked, and although his gray eyes stared defiantly at the Chinaman, I, who knew him, could read a deathly horror in their depths. The dacoit, in obedience to a guttural order from Dr. Fu Manchu, placed the cage upon the carpet, completely covering Smith's body, but leaving his neck and head exposed. The seared and pock-marked face set in a sort of placid leer, the dacoit adjusted the sliding partitions to Smith's recumbent form, and I saw the purpose of the graduated arches. They were intended to divide a human body in just such a fashion, and, as I realized, were most cunningly shaped to that end. The whole of Smith's body lay now in the wire cage, each of the 5 compartments whereof was shut off from its neighbor. The Burman stepped back and stood waiting in the doorway. Dr. Fu Manchu, removing his gaze from the face of my friend, directed it now upon me. "Mr. Commissioner Nayland Smith shall have the honor of acting as Hierophant, admitting himself to the mysteries," said Fu Manchu softly. "And you, Dr. Petrie, shall be the friend." End of chapter 28. Recording by Elaine Tweddle, Stirling, Ontario.